Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to your third or your second session this afternoon. We are blessed, contrary to the previous tables and round tables, we are blessed with a very simple question. And you know, I would like to thank Richard for giving me the easy task of moderating an easy discussion. And the easy topic is very simple. It's a question: reforming or renewing government, mission impossible? Question mark. To discuss, and by the way, the objective of our session is equally simple. We are going to answer the question. Having said that, this will be easy too because of our two speakers dialoguing on the stage. And I think they are remarkably qualified for the discussion we have for one simple reason, is that they are going to talk about government, but they know business extraordinarily well, both of them. And in order to understand and give an answer to this question, I believe it is a must to understand both government and business. So the first speaker is Yves Doz. We know him. He has been in the forum every time, I guess, or many times. A professor at the INSEAD with a chair in technology and innovation, whereby he's mostly working actually on innovation, on transformation, on innovation in governance, etc. And he has been working for quite a few years with this unique Finnish institution called SITRA, which is both kind of a think tank, a strategic advisor, and also an investment arm of the Finnish government. And from that collaboration between SITRA and Professor Doz have resulted many pieces of work. And I recommend to you the latest one, which was published in August this year, together with Mikko Kosonen, who is the director of SITRA. And it is called Governments for the Future, Building the Strategic and Agile State. So you can see that it's directly relevant to our topic. By the way, I'd like to mention that Professor Doz was the first recipient of the C.K. Prahalad Prize 4 years ago for those rare people who are able to combine practice and reflection. Our second speaker is Adrian Wooldridge. Adrian is the management editor of The Economist, and I'm sure many of us read with great interest every time it comes up his Schumpeter column, which obviously shows the closeness of Adrian's connection with Vienna and Austria. Adrian has been working on a number of books, has published one this year, which is also directly relevant to our topic. It's called The Fourth Revolution: The Global Race to Reinvent the State. And that's a book he has written with John Micklethwaite, who just happens to be the chief editor-in-chief of The Economist. By the way, these two gentlemen are truly Renaissance people. I would even say that they are dwarfing the Renaissance man, because not only did they just write this book on government, their two previous books, or two of their previous books, were devoted, one to the company, the other to God. And I happen to know that the next one will be on the future of our galaxy. So truly an impressive feature. Now, we are going to have our discussion in the following way. First, some initial comments by our two dialogists. And second, we are going to just tackle 3 topics, because Mission Impossible reforming government is a huge topic, and it's not in 45 minutes that we are going to kill it. So we decided, all 3 of us, to focus on 3 topics. The first one is, why is it difficult, not to say a formidable task, to reform government? Why is it a formidable task? Second, we are going to shed some hope and discuss the reasons to hope and believe that reforming government can indeed progress and maybe even succeed. And the third topic will deal with something which might be a familiar feeling with many of us in this room, which is love or hate government. And we are going to try to see why there are some reasons to both love and hate them. And then we'll conclude by answering the question. So, Yves, may I ask you to give us your opening statement?
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Pierre. And I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. Well, if we start with the difficulties, for me, there are really 2 major sources of difficulty. And I've done some research on governments over the past few years. The first one is that governments are actually facing stronger constraints and stronger limits to what they can do. And also that their ability to act is restricted. So let me look at the constraints and let me look at the challenges first, and then let me say a few words about the ability to act. Why am I entering the dialogue this way? Because I think it's very easy for us, and when I say us, it's people associated with corporate entities or people doing research on the corporate world to be somewhat condescending, dismissive. There are so many reasons to complain about governments, particularly seen from a business leadership standpoint, that it's easy to be critical. It's also easy to miss the difficulty and the challenge of the task. So let me say a few words about challenges and constraints, if you wish. Governments, contrary to businesses, cannot turn customers down. The least desirable customers are their best customers, and the one that they cannot turn off. We would like everyone to be, governments would love everyone to be responsible of their education, of their health, of their families, of their job, of their employment, and so on. That's unfortunately not the case. So governments end in a situation where they will deal with everyone. They are in a monopoly position where they have no choice. They cannot even introduce competition. Well, perhaps they can at the margin. Yes, there are private hospitals and clinics and charter schools and so on, but it remains somewhat marginal. Second, there is a huge challenge which has to do with the mere complexity of society. They are dealing with the most complex topics, much more complex than most management challenges. Think for a second about youth unemployment, sustained unemployment, structural unemployment, and all of its consequences on violence, drug addiction, delinquency, and so on and so forth. Think for a second about the challenges of healthcare with aging populations and the challenge of moving from essentially curative healthcare to preventive healthcare. And you could make a much longer list. Add education, add a few more. I mean, in an intergovernmental realm, of course, climate change and so on is an enormous challenge. But the challenges are very big. The customers are very demanding. They are the customers you would not like. Furthermore, I was struck earlier in the afternoon by the example of the little girl who changed the diet of the British schools. I think it's actually a wonderful story. It also shows that governments have to deal with very complex demands, and that in a way, they are vulnerable, good or bad. In this case, good, for the good. They are vulnerable to social movements. They are vulnerable to much more fickle and changing customer demands or consumer demands. With the welfare state, the expectations have been that in a way, the government is thrown in as the problem solver of last resort. So the government scope has been expanding almost against the government's will in many countries. So that has to be also looked at. We have this view of government as tentacular, when in fact, government is drawn into social issues because there are no other mechanisms, there are no other context in which to run them. So a whole lot of challenges. And media, visibility, transparency, immediacy, short-termism, and so on play even further into this. And then there are also some constraints. Governments do not operate free from politics. So in a way, political elections, the rhythm of the political life in the country and the nature of the political life in the country enables and constrains government action in a very strong way. Someone this morning was talking about the issue of change happening only when CEOs are replaced in companies. In governments, it's a little bit of the same. Change is happening in short strategic windows following an electoral period before the existing government becomes a lame duck, the existing politicians become lame ducks. So there is a strange rhythm to action there, which is imposed from the outside. The tools for action are limited. We have developed this view, perhaps in the corporate world, perhaps a simplistic view, that we can manage change, or change can be managed, and there are plethora of frameworks, most of them inspired by Kurt Lewin 60 or 70 years ago, looking at freeze, unfreeze, refreeze, and so on. Governments cannot do that. Government leaders find it much more difficult. You cannot just have a simple-minded or even a simple top-down kind of change process. Change processes and renewal processes in governments have a very different feature. They are much more lateral, middle out, I would not say bottom up, but they are a very different set of processes. They are much more pluralistic. Stakeholders, we discussed about stakeholders earlier in the day. Stakeholders have been present in government action in a much more forceful and much stronger and much more differentiated way than in businesses. We may quarrel, and quite justifiably so, like Clay Christensen did this morning with the measurement criteria and the performance criteria imposed on corporations. But think about the utility function of a government. It's very multifarious. There are many stakeholders, each of them have their particular interest. There is always these risks that one particular interest group will win. We were talking this morning about the risk of regulation being privatized, in a sense, or being hijacked by specific interest groups. Any government policy is always exposed to that risk. So maintaining balance, maintaining fairness, maintaining equality, which most democratic governments are required by law, is very difficult. And then obviously there are legal constraints. In Finland, for instance, where I'm now working part-time, to change resource allocation among ministries requires a change in constitution. To make a change in constitution requires two-thirds majority votes of parliament, at least 5 years apart. So you can get a vote next year, and then you will have to vote again in 6 years with a different parliament, obviously. So there are all kinds of institutional rigidities as well. So all of this to say, perhaps as a preliminary observation that, let's not be dismissive, let's not even be too critical of government action or inaction. They are facing formidable challenges. They have much less freedom of action than most corporate CEOs and corporate executives have. Now, there are some redeeming factors. We'll come to these. Let me just mention one, perhaps, to start with, which is, again, it's easy to harp on civil servants. It's easy to say, well, they are unionized, they are egoistic, they defend interest groups, and so on. And all of this is true. Nonetheless, and perhaps I'm optimistic there, but I believe that the sense of common good is not entirely lost. It is just a bit like we were discussing earlier in the day, the fact that workers in companies are disengaged, so are civil servants. But in some way, they would like to be re-engaged. So I think there is hope for change. But we'll come to this perhaps later in the conversation.
Very good. Thank you, Yves. Now, Adrian, what is your starting perspective?
3 points. Firstly, government matters. I think there's a widespread perception, particularly in the business world, which is well represented here, that government doesn't matter. It's an annoyance. It's a sort of noise which we want to turn down. There are libertarians who think that we can get rid of government. Grover Norquist, the head of the Americans for Tax Reform, said that his aim is to shrink government to such a size that it can be drowned in the bathtub. Many voters, when they vote, essentially want to punish politicians for being so much like politicians. Now, I can understand why people should have that perception. I'm just reading the Financial Times here, today's Financial Times. There's a great deal of fuss about a man called Jean-Claude Juncker, who it seems is head of the European Commission. There's a great deal of worry about the tax regime in Luxembourg, which seems to be rather distorted in favor of escaping paying taxes. He says he can't do anything about that, he's got nothing to do with that. And then I read further down and discover that for the previous 18 years he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and before that he was the Finance Minister. Now, I can understand why people loathe politicians as a result of that, but nevertheless, government matters. We would rather live in a well-governed, well-administered society than the Congo, for example. The second point I'd like to make is that government can be reformed. It's very easy to imagine that it's just there, it can't be changed, it's resistant to all changes, and like Jean-Claude Juncker, that you could be Prime Minister of a country for 18 years and have nothing to do with its policies. But nevertheless, if you look back over history, you see that the state has changed dramatically, fundamentally. I've just written a book about this subject, tracing the three great revolutions in the nature of the state, from a state that's designed to provide security to one that's designed to guarantee liberty to one that's designed to provide basic welfare for its citizens. So the state is a dramatically evolving entity, and it would be peculiar to think that that evolution has ended. Indeed, it would be peculiar to think that the sort of technological changes that are sweeping through the private sector to do with information technology will not radically and fundamentally change the nature and workings of the state. Indeed, I think that they will. And the third point I'd like to make is that reforming the state actually matters enormously. One of the main reasons why the West, America and Europe, has pulled ahead of the rest of the world since 1500 is because it's created better states. It solved the problem of public order, it solved the problem of liberty and accountability, it solved the problem of welfare. It was constantly thinking, adjusting, and improving the state. Now, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen that that advantage in the West has declined. We've had a sort of democratic sclerosis, which means the state in the West is becoming less efficient, less powerful, less competent, at the same time that the authoritarian, Mandarin, top-down state in the Chinese world has become better at doing what it's doing, at delivering growth, at delivering services for its people. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that we should improve our government, improve our state, not just because that will create a better life for citizens, but because if the democratic, liberal, individualist ideal is to win out over the authoritarian ideal, we need actually to have a functioning state. Thank you.
The wonderful contribution of our two dialogists is that they actually covered already everything we wanted to discuss in their preliminary statements. I think that's brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. And we can close the session.
Cocktails.
However, as we have 45 minutes, we are going to use them. Now, let's move or stay with the first topic, which is, the difficulty of reforming government. Why is it a formidable task? You gave us a very good list of the major constraints government is facing. Isn't there another point that actually the role of governments is not just to govern. The role of government is to play a role in, for example, driving new initiatives, driving large projects, etc., which add to the complexity of being a government. How do you see that?
Yves,
go first. Well, one, I think you're right. There is a role for government which extends beyond the traditional roles of sovereignty functions, provision of public services and education and so on, which would have infrastructures. I was struck this morning again with the discussion of public infrastructures over the long term, infrastructures in a wide sense, not just physical, but including universities and so on. What I see in perhaps more so in Europe than anywhere else, except China and smaller countries in Asia like Singapore, is really the state as an orchestrator of complex economic and social development projects. I mean, take an example that is very much in the press these days. Denmark ambitions to become essentially energy neutral or energy independent, in other words, not to consume energy, in the next 25 or 35 years, I mean, by 2050. And it's a very ambitious project. Would that project take place without some amount of government orchestration, government coordination around the development of the wind turbine industry, the redevelopment of Copenhagen to make it an energy neutral city? I doubt it. You can argue this would naturally emerge from ecosystem interaction among private companies, among civil society organizations, perhaps. But I think there is more and more a role of orchestration of economic, social, environmental development on the part of states, on the part of governments, which they cannot entirely avoid, and they probably should not avoid. There is obviously a role around sustainability, like in the Danish case. There are roles around healthcare and many others. So I think, like it or not, the role of government is probably becoming less an administrator, less a deliverer of services. Some of these can actually be privatized. I mean, Singapore is very interesting from that standpoint, because the actual Singapore budget is only 17, national government budget is only 17% of GNP. Now, when you dig further, versus 50 and some in most European countries, or 40 and some. When you dig further into Singapore, what you find is a lot of basic government services have been privatized. They're operated under some form of regulation, and they have freed up the government to worry about different things, like water supply, like climate change, the impact on Singapore, like global transportation and shipping infrastructure and whatever else. So in a sense, we could probably see the state migrate from the role of deliverer of basic social services, probably keeping some which are naturally governmental, like law and order and defense and fiscal policies, probably, or at least might migrate to Europe, the European context, and basically invest governmental energy on new projects, new investments, orchestrating new developments. So I think the role is going to shift. I see the role shifting very much over the next decades or few years even.
How do you see it, Adrian?
Two points about government inefficiency. One is that the great political scientist James Q. Wilson said that the whole point about government is that it's designed to be inefficient. That the whole point about the American political system in particular was that it was designed as a defense mechanism against that great and evil tyrant George III. It was designed to divide power to make sure that you couldn't create a tyranny, and to some extent that's a desirable end. You want to make power accountable, you want to make power divided, and you want to make sure that everybody has some sort of ability to frustrate the people that they don't agree with. But secondly, I think in more recent years, government has become too inefficient or too divided or too difficult to deal with. And I think the problem is to do with size and ambition, that government has become overloaded with functions and overloaded with ambitions. There's a character in a book called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory called Augustus Gloop, who keeps eating and eating and eating chocolates, as one is very tempted to do in Vienna, and eventually explodes. And I think that government has become that sort of creature. There's a sense in which we need actually to focus government much more precisely on what it absolutely needs to do, and to prevent it from doing ancillary things that it doesn't need to do in order to make it efficient in the first place.
Can I just...
yeah, please.
May I just add one comment? I think I fully agree. And I think part of the issue there is the most frequently used rule or action, the most frequently used tool for governments is rules. So you create more rules and regulations which are overseen by more and more agencies. To take a very simple example, if you go back to one of, I can't remember which one, but Francis Fukuyama in one of his books has a wonderful example about the US National Forest Service, which was seen as one of the most efficient, best run, most balanced government service in the world. And when you look at it today, there are 14 different agencies that have been intervening, supervising, undermining the role of the US National Forest Service, meaning that these poor people are demoralized, disengaged, don't know what to do next, are under a lot of contradictory pressures, and these cannot fit. So I think there is also this proliferation of rules and the justification of more and more governmental agencies mingling into more and more relatively simple tasks and problems in a way which is not particularly helpful.
And this regulatory mania on the part of government spills over into things that aren't essentially part of government or into the private sector. I recently had to give a talk at Arizona State University, and I thought, yes, that's nice. I'd like to go to Arizona, particularly in the English autumn and winter. So then they sent me the forms I had to fill in. Page upon page upon page of forms, what was my racial background, blah, 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 blah. And then they said, how much will you be spending on breakfast on the day that you're there? I mean, I'm sure this kept a lot of bureaucrats in Arizona State University employed ticking these boxes, but it's a complete mania. So government encourages a disease that spreads throughout the rest of society.
Welcome to the world of public universities.
I won't be going back.
By the way, Adrian, what was the figure?
$37.
My goodness, you're such an eater. So I think we understand topic number one, that government is complicated, bloated in some respects, with missions which can go very far, and, very difficult to reform. Despite that, as soon as you started talking about it, topic number two, you kind of let some hope shine that government can be transformed, can be reformed. So why is that? Why this feeling of some optimism? Adrian?
Well, I have partly because of necessity. I think there was an economist called Herb Stein who, making what passes for a joke in the world of economics, said that if something can't go on, it will stop. And I think the way that we currently do government, given the amount of debt that we have in the world, will change. We have, $17 trillion of outstanding debt in the West, accumulated simply since 2007. America has balanced its budget 3 times since 1960. France, I don't think, has balanced its budget since 1974, although it may be about to do that next year, who knows?
Really?
Miracles may happen. So we've lived on debt for a long time, and I don't think, given the change in the demographic profile of the Western population, with an increasing number of old people being supported by a decreasing number of younger people, that is possible. But also, I think more optimistically, we have the possibility to do government dramatically better, because the information technology revolution is fundamentally changing our capacity to provide medical services, to provide education, to provide policing. Information, what government is essentially about, is about controlling, dispersing, distributing information, and that is being fundamentally changed by the information revolution.
And we see some initiatives, like, for example, in the UK, creating 4 years ago a kind of center for the digital progress of the UK government has been quite effective.
I think it has been effective, and having interacted with both the American Inland Revenue Service and the British Inland Revenue Tax Service, it's hugely better than it was. And I think if you go to Scandinavia, you see an even better system whereby you can basically fill your tax form online or over your mobile phone and send it back. In America, there isn't enough bandwidth in the mobile phone system to take their tax forms.
So your optimism, or relative optimism, is based on growing pressures and new tools for government to do things differently, notably technology.
I think that if you are in a world where government is completely out of sync with people's private sector expectations, private sector dealings, that can't be sustained. I think there will be a constant pressure on citizens who are used to interacting with their mobile phone service or their television service or other things in the private sector, which will change the way that they interact with government. Has to do so.
The way I see it is that the better and better customer experiences provided by the private sector,
by Capgemini,
notably, will lead to a significant pressure for much better citizen experience.
Definitely.
How do you see it, Yves?
Well, I think all of this is true. So let me just add one or two more points that we observed in basically researching the experience of government, the few governments that have made significant progress in transforming themselves and are not operating in a quasi-autocratic context. So we have made much of Singapore, but is the Singapore example transferable to Europe? Not clear. What did we find among Scotland, Norway, Sweden very much, and some US states? Interestingly enough, just for a little anecdote here, but it's a very telling one. Back in the late 90s, the Commonwealth of Virginia in the US, I'm told, was very badly run by a very politicized and inefficient local government system. Many of the business leaders of Virginia were deeply disappointed with what was going on, and they decided to basically intervene, and they told very bluntly to the then governor, unless you reform very deeply the way this place is run, we'll basically move out. And since Virginia is next to Washington, they could move to Maryland or wherever else relatively easily. And essentially business took over and created some kind of council which reformed the state of Virginia, introducing a whole series of measures having to do with strategic development, more foresight, better understanding of the world outside, having to do with better governance, having to do with processes for resource allocation which were more strategic and more flexible, and so on and so forth. And it was very interesting, the way I became familiar with that example was via the Scottish Nationalist Party, where I did some research work in Scotland. I was told by the SNP leaders, well, we found our inspirations from Virginia. And I said, oh, really? And I dug into this. So it's interesting that there are some examples like this. Now, what do we find common to these examples? Just one more minute on this. One, a greater interest and orientation towards strategic foresight. We know, however, that strategic foresight has its limit when the world is very complex. So interestingly enough, Singapore, which is often kind of a step ahead of most, is putting all kinds of resources into complexity analysis. So far, not very productively, because it's not clear to me that complexity theory, not to them, that complexity theory really applies. But foresight, complexity, and so on are one line of reasoning. Another line of effort is basically, and that's a British way of innovating in a way, is what is called in the Anglo-Saxon world the whole of government approach, or a more unitary approach, which I think has been pushed to its fullest form in Sweden, where essentially they work as a completely unitary government. They have dissolved the separate ministerial silos. They have decentralized in the form of independent agencies, some of which are privatized, most of which have employment contracts and financial performance targets which are very close to private sector. So basically, they've done away with the big, bulky bureaucracy, either by decentralizing into focused agencies or by integrating more into a unified government. And that unified government works very much also as a collective body, truly applying a principle of cabinet responsibility, where in a sense, each and every of the ministers, and every member of the government is responsible for all the actions of any of the colleagues. So creating a tremendous sense of unity. So I think there are lots of things that can be done. And that's why I'm optimistic in a way. I say there are good examples. Now you can argue, do they scale up? It works well. I mean, all of these places, Virginia, Scotland, Finland, Sweden, etc., are a few million. Singapore are a few million, administer a few million citizens, not more, not really less. So there's perhaps a question of scalability. There is perhaps an issue of the integrity of the underlying moral and systems. These are not places where corruption is rampant and so on. So there are probably enabling conditions about size and ethics and so on.
Very good. So we see, a formidable task. We see good reasons for optimism. And by the way, with your Virginia example, Yves, you are giving us the clue to our third topic, which is, what does the audience think about reforming government? What's the role of executives in that? Is there any reason for this love-hate relationship, or can we improve a little bit the love ratio and come to a more positive role of executives towards government? How do you see that?
You mean the role of the business community? Yes, well, I just wanted to start off by talking about what Yves was saying, because if you look at these attempts to reform government, and I would add California to the example of Virginia, one of the things that's always happened is a crisis. All these things have been driven by crises. So Sweden had become an absurdly bloated state with 67% of GDP going to the government, tax rates up to 100%. And then in 1992, they had a vast crisis, which forced them to reform. In Britain, we had the financial crisis. Over and over again, the mother of optimism for reformers is a terrible crisis. But I think that executives can play a very, very important role in change, so long as they get away from this mindset that government is irrelevant, a noise to be turned down, or government is just business by other means. It's just a badly run private business. It's not, as Yves says, it has different constituencies. It has to serve in many, it can't sack its constituents. It has to serve sometimes the most difficult constituents. So executives have to understand that government is a different business, but nevertheless, when they have understood that, there have been some remarkable experiences. Bloomberg's role in New York was very inspiring. I would also point to the role of a man called Nicholas Berggruen in California. California was basically the Greece of the United States. And I say that, I hope, without offending too many Californians or Greeks in the room. It was basically going bankrupt, it was a mess, and it was incredibly poorly governed. And what the reformers did, led by Nicholas Berggruen, who was a private investor and businessman, was to say, we must look in the long term. So he created the long-term committee to look at the long-term future of the country, of the states, and we must balance our budget. We can't keep having this system, and we must balance the political system so that you have a better system of primaries, a better system, or a less of a gerrymandered political system. He was one of the drivers of this because he saw that basically it was ultimately going to drive business out of California if it continued to be such a mess. So I think there are many examples of businessmen who worked very well as executives or also very well as people who said, actually, you need to change this model.
All of that, understanding well the differences between a corporation and a state.
Yes.
And, you know, the corporation is a dictatorship. The
Yes.
state is a democracy. That might be a very first important difference to understand.
Sure.
Very good.
Can I just
Yeah,
one
please,
comment?
Yves.
Perhaps, I mean, if you reverse the order of thinking there, if what we heard earlier in the afternoon is true, and I believe it's going to be true because it's highly desirable. In other words, to create actually more, not really democracy, but more engagement, more participation, more voice in a more distributed fashion in companies, you could argue that probably the processes of change in companies are going to be less dictatorial or less autocratic and more pluralistic. So perhaps there is actually even something to be learned back from the experience of more pluralistic contexts, like universities, hospitals, health systems, governments at large, to look at the management of companies in the future. So I would make both points, that there is probably cross-fertilization both ways
Interesting
to be
observation.
pursued.
So, if I end up by asking you the question, mission impossible question mark, what's your answer? Adrian?
Mission essential.
Mission essential. Not an essential mission, but mission essential. Because?
Because governments are a vital part of the competitiveness of the economy. They're 40–50% of GDP. They set the framework in which private companies operate, and at the moment the tendency is, outside some places like Sweden, pretty desperate actually.
So mission essential and
Yes.
even possible.
Yeah, essential,
And
possible,
you,
and
Yves?
to be recommended.
Mission very difficult, but potentially feasible.
Okay,
Or
very good.
achievable.
So I translate that into saying the answer is yes. Now we have time for a couple of questions from you on this simple topic. Yes, please. Here in the third rank. Could you give a mic here, please? Here, this gentleman with the pink shirt.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
My name is Bogdan Budzan. I'm former dean of the business school in Ukraine. I spent in government 2 years from 91 after Moscow coup, and I was head of department. I try to invent this government from inside. I understand that when society is not democratic society, to change something in government, absolutely impossible. I tried to do something, and people around me, all of them was from old system. And if you not change the system, political system, it's very important, it's impossible to change something in government, to invent or reinvent. I was so frustrated that after 2 years, I started to read Peter Drucker books and decided to go to business education.
And your question is?
And after a short program at Harvard Business School, I became dean of the business school. I invite some people from government, my former partners, to go to study management, business, and some of them went back to government, but few of them not. But new people, new generation, thinking today that we really need new government with new principle. We can reinvent or invent new government if we reinvent the principle through which this government is built. In my country today, we are in serious stage. We have new parliament, new government. Fortunately, in new parliament, we do not have Communist Party. It's a big achievement of our society today. And my general opinion is that we should release the power of society, which by voting for new government can create new principle and new government for the wealth, for the good for people. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. By the way, the process you launched in '91 seems to be still somewhat underway, yes. Right? Do we have questions? Yes? Who is that? Here. The microphone is closer. Yes, please.
I'm Geeta Piramal from India. We have a very different type of prime minister who has just taken over. So the question is, between the US and China, which is the better government and why?
I propose we skip this question, except... Oh, no, we don't skip the question, we skip the answer. It might be easier. Or do you have a clear-cut opinion on that?
I have a very clear-cut opinion on it. I think that the gap between the United States and China in terms of the quality of its government used to be very large. Democracy clearly much better than authoritarian dictatorship. And that the gap is narrowing because democracy has become silted up, prey to interest groups, incapable even of passing a budget, and China has become better at what it's doing. Its Mandarin government, for all its faults, can be quite efficient. So if you go to much of the emerging world, if you go to Africa now, they don't look to America as the shining model of democracy. They look to China as a model of efficiency. And I think that's an incredibly depressing fact.
May I just add to this one comment?
Yes, Yves.
I was in a very interesting conversation actually yesterday with some former administrator of the IMF and an American CEO and so on. We were having lunch together, and there was a very interesting conversation saying, if China manages to root out corruption, and from the difficulties of luxury brands in China, there is clearly some progress being made, some very significant progress. If China manages to root out corruption, it may end up being a better government. And the argument, the other side of the argument was very interesting. Yeah? It was basically saying, if you think about the intensification of lobbying, yeah? Interest groups, political giving, and so on in the US, it's a form of rampant corruption, which is going to be very, very serious in the future. So there was an interesting addition to your line of reasoning, saying China is on an up curve, an upsloping curve, and the US is facing growing problems in its political system.
It's so legalized corruption, unlike the illegal corruption in France. It's actually legalized corruption. They're allowed to do it. Right. It's appalling.
So you have a more clear than expected answer to your question, and we are not going to discuss the position of India compared with the two. Just a last question, please. Here. Yes, this lady in front.
Julia Hobsbawm, Cass Business School and Editorial Intelligence. I wanted to ask a question about the pipeline of politicians. In the UK, where I come from, there's been a lot of criticism of PPE and Oxford and the way in which future political leaders are incubated. So what's your view about the pipeline of politicians and whether further education is hindering or helping that process for a better future for government?
Well, I mean, I think the pipeline of politicians, if I look at politics in Britain, is very weak. I wouldn't put all the blame on PPE, although as a history graduate, I'd be quite happy to put 95% of it on them. But I think it's because if you look at the great people who dominated British politics for much of the post-war period, they were nurtured in the trade union movement, or they were nurtured in the army, or they were nurtured in the business side. Now they go straight from university into think tanks. They never have an experience of the broader world. These parties have no roots in society whatsoever. The British Tory Party in 1950 had 2 million members. It now has 130,000 members. So these parties have no roots in society. They don't represent anybody. And so the political parties, which are the basis of democracy, are dying on their feet. That's an appalling thing. More broadly than that, China recruits its politicians from engineers. America recruits its politicians from lawyers. I won't say more.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Well, let's bring this session to a close. I'd like to personally, first of all, thank the two dialogists for their excellent work today. And I'd like to say that the answer to your question, being relatively positive one, is a very good one for business. Because if you ever try to do business in a state which is not solid, and with a government which is not functional, you are in for an awful time. Thank you very much.